Anyways, we'll get back to our series. We're in the book of Hosea. You know, I always battle when God tells me to preach through a book because I'm more of a topical preacher, but God always does something when we go through a book like this. And I don't know about you, but he's made a big impact in me in these first 3 chapters. This whole idea of incomprehensible love. Like the idea in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 17 and 19, that we would know the love of Christ which surpasses knowledge, like that the saints should know the breadth of his love, the width and the length and the depth and the height of his love. Like it should be something that we continue to seek out and to understand because it goes beyond any boundaries. It just blows me away as you learn more and more about his love as time goes on and how he desires us as individuals. And as we've been throughout this series of incomprehensible love, we've seen how it includes so many different aspects of love. That in week 1, if you weren't here, quickly to recap, we looked at chapter 1, which was a love that we called a dangerous love. The incomprehensible love includes a dangerous love. In fact, it often starts with dangerous love. You know, that love often starts as a dangerous love. Think about this. The idea that danger always involves risk, and love involves risk. If you're going to put your heart out there, it involves risk. It can be dangerous. And the fact that God would tell his young prophet, just stepping into ministry as a single man, now what I want you to do is go out and marry a whore, was dangerous love. And not only go marry a whore, but I want you to have 3 kids of whoredom. I want you to have kids of whoredom. Like, do we comprehend that? Have 3 kids that come from this aspect of whoredom. Like, that's dangerous. That's risky. Why would you even want to step out into that sort of thing? But God's like so much wanting to show the world his incomprehensible love. We have a hard time understanding this. But this incomprehensible love always starts with being a risk taker. That dangerous love. And then he progressed from dangerous love to, he talked about in chapter 2, a tough love that leads to a restorative love. And the idea is you step out in dangerous love and you're willing to risk everything. And sometimes at the beginning, God has to break things down in order to build them back up the way that he wants them so that they glorify him. And so sometimes he takes certain things away and he forms and he shapes and he puts you through the pain in order to bring you to such a place of restoration that you will glorify him in your love, in your life. And so chapter 2, we've seen that tough love. And then in chapter 3, last week, the message that God gave me probably impacted me more than it impacted anybody else. This idea that we would know a love that surpasses knowledge. The idea that it's a love that goes beyond just a pass, beyond just accidentally overthrowing, but that word surpassing, meaning that it goes so far beyond the mark that it was obvious you weren't even aiming at the mark. A surpassing love. The world has these marks and these boundaries of what love should look like, but God's saying, no, a surpassing love is so far beyond those marks, it's obvious you're not even trying to match the world's love. You're way beyond. And so he tells Hosea, I want you to go and take Gomer back. Yeah. I know that she's cheated on you. She's been an adulterous woman. That she's had a couple kids that maybe aren't even yours. That she started this thing shortly after your first child. And she's continued it for years. Now she's not even living with you. She's done this multiple times. But I want you to show the world what a surpassing love looks like. To go and get your wife back. A surpassing love, like goes beyond comprehension, incomprehensible, that God would call his person, his people, to be able to love like that. And I even had some people come up to me, and I can say this because they're not in the second service, they came to first service. This week, as long as they don't watch the video, that this week, like one came like, I need some prayer. I need to know what to do, Pastor. Like, here's what's going on in my life, and here's this. I'm like, okay. Your friend tells you, Corey, your friend says, forget her. Right? But Corey, your pastor, has to tell you what God's word really says. And you heard my sermon, so we don't really need to have this conversation. Because I didn't tell it to you. I didn't preach because I know of people's circumstances. I preached through a book that God set beforehand, and if his word hits you in that area of your life, hey, then let the conviction fall upon you. You got to do what you got to do, and if he's calling you to do something, I encourage you to pursue the Lord's word in your life. But I've had people say, it's too hard. Like, I know, that's not me. I'm just a human being. I'm not God. I can't do what his surpassing love does for people. Well, no, but God showed that his love can be done through Hosea, right? Like, yes, I understand this type of dangerous, tough, and surpassing love seems like an impossible love. Before I even preached this series, I think I warned everybody, like, I think this is going to be, I just had this feeling, one of the most challenging sermon series you'll ever heard, that we'll have ever went through together. Not just because God hammers sin in the Old Testament prophet books, but because love, when you start to comprehend God's love for us and what his expectation of our love towards others should be, like, it blows your mind. It seems like an impossible love. It's not just incomprehensible love, it's an impossible love. Like, how could I ever do that? I'm just a human. But God didn't call his followers to live in the natural and do what the rest of the world does. He's called us to be able to live in the impossible, to make the impossible look possible because of our faith in him and what he can do through us. That's the life that he has called us to. And that's why, we can read scriptures like Philippians 4:13 and get all excited, and Tebow can put it under his eyes in the football field, and, people get pumped up, and we talk about, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, right? We get wound up with verses like that. I could preach that right now, and there'd be somebody shouting amen, like, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Yeah, I've got to come through this. Well, brother, you can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. You get all fired up and emotional and cheering, and yes, you can. What about surpassing love? What about the greatest betrayal in your life? And you don't want to love again in that same way. Oh, you can do all things, but you can't do this. Except for putting my heart back out there. Yeah, I can get through not getting my full paycheck this week and finding a way to pay my bills anyways. Okay, I know I needed prayer for that, but, that's one thing. I can do all things, that's one thing, but man, to say that I'm supposed to love again, that I'm supposed to forgive them again, like, oh, yeah, right? What about forgiving? Speaking of forgiving, like, they've done this how many times, and yet you don't want to forgive again, right? Why would you forgive again? Like, they've done it so many times over again. I can do all things through Christ, but forgive again? Are you kidding me? Right? We dismiss all of this because, we think that it sounds too difficult. And the reality, is this, that we can, most of us know this, even with the little bit of knowledge you may have as a Christian, we can do all things through Christ. It's just that we don't want to do all things through Christ. Yeah, I know that I can love again, but the truth is, it hurt me so bad the first time that I don't want to. Right? I know that I can forgive. I can forgive, but I can do all things, but I don't want to do all things. And I don't know about you guys, but this is a struggle in my life. I like to tell on myself. Over the years, I don't know why, I had this anger problem, and I still struggle with my anger, and you guys have heard me talk about it before at times. And my wife, I think, would attest to the fact that it's gotten better over the last 20 years, but sometimes I still have issues. And so, there's times where I know, like, I can surrender my temper. And I know that I can, because I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, that he is my strength, that he's helped me to hold my temper back before, and that I have the ability. But I'll be honest with you, there's just flat out times I don't want to hold my temper back. Because letting go of my temper just makes me feel better for a little while. Maybe not in the long term, but for that short term, I'm going to glory in it. Like, I let my temper go, and man, I will feel better. And the reality is, when I let my temper go, it probably humbles the person that I think needs to be humbled right now. And you know what? I'm going to feel better about that too. Right? Like, I know that I can do all things, but I don't always want to do all things. When it comes to forgiveness, there's been times where, you know what? I know that I can forgive them. I know that I can go and we can have this conversation and sit down and forgiveness can happen. But the reality is, I don't want to forgive right now. Anybody been like I know I know that holding on to unforgiveness creates poison in my life, that it creates bitterness in my life. I know the dangers of it, but the reality is, you know what? I enjoy holding on to this unforgiveness at the moment. Because as long as I hold on to this, I feel like there's some little bit of power that I might have over that individual by making them miserable too, because I'm still holding on to unforgiveness, and I can keep them in that place of shame and guilt and condemnation, and you better suffer there and hurt like I've suffered. Like, I know that I can, but the reality is that I don't want to let go of this unforgiveness. Because in the short term, it's certainly making me feel better about the situation. Right? Because the reality is, we want people to hurt like we hurt. We don't ever want to admit that, especially as Christians. But when somebody says a harsh word to us, we say a harsh word back. We don't believe in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth because that's Old Testament. We just believe in harsh words for harsh words and backstabbing for backstabbing and, cutting each other down for cutting each other. We believe in all the same stuff, but just in a different way. And the truth is, we know that we can, we just don't want to. I can do all things. I just don't want to do all things. And that's the kind of attitude that we so often develop in life. And I could probably just preach the rest of the time on just this. There are times you know what to do. You know what you should be doing. You know what the right thing is. You know what the God thing is, but you don't do it. Because the reality is, it's so much easier physically, emotionally, and spiritually to take the easy way out. Man, it's a whole lot easier for me to just not even worry about forgiving that person. Let them suffer. Let them go through whatever they got to go through. I don't even care. Like, it's just easier for me not to have to humble myself and go to them. To have to go through the pain of talking to them. To have to go through maybe possibly opening up the door so that there's a restored relationship, that they could possibly hurt me again. I don't even want to go down that. It's so much easier to not have to deal with that because of the potential work that I would have to do in order to do that. And that's how it is, whether it's, any of the fruit of the spirits, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. Like it's just so many times we want to take the easy way. And I think that sometimes, like the church, the Pentecostal side of church is a little bit more into this, but we lack in this when it comes to like laying hands on the sick and seeing them healed and that sort of stepping out in faith type of thing and taking that risk and in that place of compassion and showing love and desiring to see God glorified in certain situations. But I sometimes think that that's even easier than it is for Pentecostal Christians to show love in a surpassing way. Forgiveness in a surpassing way. We want to take the easy way out in life. And what we have to understand is that this is the life of impossibilities that God has called his followers to live. And this is the attitude of wanting to take the easy way out, do things our way because we don't want to go through the work. And yes, we may know of the truth, even if it's a little bit of truth, but we don't want to do the truth. This is the attitude that God addresses through Hosea in chapter 4. Now, I want to show you there's a transition in the first 3 chapters, and then in 4 and beyond. He more directly in the first 3 chapters was referencing Hosea and Gomer's relationship, right? Because his whole intention was to show us that there's a vertical relationship and a horizontal relationship, and God's love for his people is the same as he was showing Hosea's love is for Gomer. We're talking about a vertical and a horizontal relationship here. And he's like, now that you understand my relationship for my people in the first 3 chapters by looking at them as the example, I'm going to start speaking directly to you. And so in chapter 4 and beyond, it's God's words directly to his people, because we now have the understanding that to say we believe in God is much more than just a belief, but it's about a relationship that he views is supposed to be a marital relationship in the likeness of marriage. And that when we sin, it's much more than just a little sin. When we don't listen to him, when we don't take his advice or his guidance, when we ignore his words and say, yeah, I know, but I don't want to, and we do something differently, when we do those things, it's much more than just a little thing, but that he views sin as betrayal, spiritual adultery. Because it always comes back to the fact that this is about a marriage relationship. This isn't about master and servant, friend and friend. He wants us to understand this is about, I view you as my bride. My bride. View me as your groom. And so we see this played out. Paul describes it, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2. He says, for I'm jealous for you with the jealousy of God himself. I promised you, the church, as a pure, everybody say pure, as a pure bride to one husband, Christ, New Living Translation. Paul's trying to help the church understand what the Old Testament was trying to get their people to understand is, hey, listen, it's about a bridal relationship. This is about everything I do in life should represent that I am getting married to Jesus. That's why I got dressed up today. When we go about life and everything that we do, can you imagine if you dress like this? We'd be called Mormons. Never mind. You're representing being married to Jesus. You're representing being married to Jesus and everything. If you had to dress like this to remind yourself that in everything you do in everyday life, like that you are representing being married to Jesus if you say that you believe in God. And Paul says, listen, if you say that in a marriage, I'm wanting you to understand that I'm trying to get you guys to a place where I can present you as the pure, the virgin bride of Christ. He tells the church in Ephesus, 5:27, when he talks about being washed by his word, that brings a cleansing, right? That he did this to present the church, the bride, to himself as a glorious church without spot or wrinkle or any other blemish. Instead, she'll be holy and without fault. Like there's this whole concept throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament that they're trying to get us to understand. God's trying to get us to understand that this relationship with God is about being his bride, and this incomprehensible love includes this relational love. And even when we see a tough love, like when we'll go through chapter 4, it's only a tough love because it's first a relational love. If you were getting married and your spouse was doing all of these other things, committing adultery against you, like you might show a little tough love because you love them. There's a relational love that was there first, and you'd want them to restore them to you. And that's what God's going through as we go through these chapters. So as we go into Hosea chapter 4, verse 1, the scripture says this. Hosea chapter 4, verse 1. Are my batteries still working? Do we have Hosea chapter 4, verse 1? All right. Thank you. Hear the word of the Lord, you children of Israel. Everybody say hear. Like hearing, I think, is half the problem. In the original language, in the Hebrew, the word hear is shema. And shema means to hear attentively. Hear attentively. But it's also listen to obey. So you're giving you're hearing attentively. That way that you can then obey whatever it is that's being told. And you'll see that a lot of the prophets started off with saying this exact same thing from the God, because it's not just coming from a man, but it's coming from the Lord. Hear the word of the Lord through the man. And it's kind of like the emergency broadcasting system of the day at that time. And if you remember, some of you may not, like that used to come on the TV once in a while and then on the radio. And I'm not very good at that sort of thing, but it's like, it's really annoying. Like, is that annoying yet? All right. Right. I just like to emphasize a point once in a while. So this really annoying noise comes on. Why? To get your attention. And then once he has your attention, they're like, listen, there's a tornado about to wipe out the Silver Valley. Everybody run to the nearest school and take shelter, right? And if you thought there was a tornado coming to wipe out the Silver Valley because you just gave your attention to this alert that came to you, then you would be wise if you want to stay safe and you want to be healthy in life, continued health, to do what the warning was telling you to do and go to the shelter, right? And that's exactly what's taking place in this word right here by the prophet. He's like, here, that's the word that he's using. Emergency broadcast system. Here's about what's to take place in life. Now you've got to start doing this in order to stay safe in life and to live a healthy and prosperous life. So he says, hear the word of the Lord, you children of Israel, for the Lord brings a charge against the inhabitants of the land. He's bringing the charge. And what's this idea of a charge? It's like a lawsuit. Like, listen, we decided that we were going to get married, and you've been doing all these other things, cheating on me in different ways, that, you know what, I'm going to bring a charge against you. Because what's potential is a separation. Possibly a divorce. And so here's the charges. And he goes on with the charges now. No, go back to verse 1. He says, there is no truth or mercy or knowledge of God in the land. Verse 2. By swearing and lying, killing and stealing, committing adultery, they break all restraint. The idea of breaking all restraint means that it's a people who doesn't want to live within boundaries of life, because they view boundaries as being bad. Rules and regulations, they're just made to be broken. Like boundaries are horrible and we can do whatever we want to do. It's the idea of anarchy in a culture. That there's no real authority, or the authority that's in the culture isn't respected and listened to, so they do whatever they want to do. And then that says with bloodshed upon bloodshed, which means that there's mass violence. And all these sins are really social, and they're related, and it leads to a violent culture. And what we'll see here, that in God's charge against his bride, against his people, is that he's talking about 3 sins of omission. 3 sins of omission. And he's talking about 7 sins of commission. And I really want us to just hone in more on the sins of omission. These are things that are omitted from our life that we don't do, that means that there's still a sin that God desires that we would do. And so the first one, he said, is that there's no truth in the land. Now, this idea of no truth in the land doesn't mean that there's not any truth being spoken or any truth being talked about, but if you look at certain translations and in the original language, you'll see that the word truth actually is the word faithfulness. So some translations that you may have actually use the word, there's no faithfulness in the land. And the connection between truth and faithfulness is this, that you can speak a truth, but if your life doesn't reflect that truth, then you don't really believe that it's probably true. Or nobody else is going to believe that it's true. It's just a lie that's being spoken. And so really, there's a lot of things that are being said, but there's no faithfulness to that truth. Does that make sense? So in other words, like, if I were to have taught my daughters how to drive, and I said, this big red octagon sign that has the words S-T-O-P on it, it means stop, right? And I'd say that's the truth. And so if I stopped every time I seen that sign and I was training them up on how to drive in life, then they would also begin to stop. But if I said, you know what, that sign right there, that big red octagon sign with the letters S-T-O-P, it means stop. So you're supposed to stop, but every time they're with me, I just push the gas down a little bit further, a little bit harder, so that I can go through the four-way before any other cars come to a complete stop. And that's what they get taught. Then they would be like, oh yeah, that's not really true. Like, yeah, that's what you say is true, but by the actions that you live, you're actually teaching us. Like, it's not really, if it is truth, that important of a truth. There's no faithfulness to what I'm saying is true. It's the word faithfulness. It's the word sureness. There's a surety to the truth that's being shared that you can stand on. There's a reliability. Like, it's not going to sink. It's not going to bend. It's not going to break. It's not going to be something else when circumstances change. When you think about faithfulness in a marriage, that's what you're talking about. It needs this sureness. This reliability. When life changes, it's not going to snap the relationship because something's changed. You're going to be sure, you're going to be solid, you're going to be steady. That's what it means when you were dating in high school, and you might have dated somebody once or twice, right? And then you go and you're still maybe dating somebody else, but you're starting to date this person more frequently. You're still hanging out with your friends, and then you get to this place where you're growing in feelings, and you finally say to each other, what do you say? You want to go steady? I don't know if that's used nowadays, but back in my day, like, that was the official word. That official word, steady. Let's go steady. And what did steady mean? Steady meant there's none of this. There's none of this. Bouncing over here. Bouncing back. But that there would be something that's sure. Something that's reliable. We can now rely on each other. Right? And so what he's saying is there's no steadiness. There's no faithfulness in the land. You guys talk a lot about truth, but your actions aren't matching what you're saying is true. The second thing that he says that there's none of is mercy. Now, mercy, biblically, is typically the idea that we don't get what we deserve. So, like, you deserve jail, but you don't get jail because of mercy, right? But the idea here in the original language is actually the word kindness or goodness. And so it's the idea that there was no goodness or kindness in the land. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand this, because that doesn't mean that people weren't kind to each other. But like we talked about in Surpassing Love last week, that a surpassing love goes beyond world's boundaries. And what do the world's boundaries say about love? That, like, we are kind to people who are kind to us. We love people who love us. And yet Jesus would say, what kind of love is that just loves people that love them? Even the world has that kind of love, right? So we're not talking about just being kind to each other, that there was no kindness in society. There was probably kindness to people that were kind to them, but what's being referenced here is a kindness that's willing to go beyond the worldly mark, the worldly boundary. And so when you get into the root word here, it's talking about bowing to each other, which is the idea of honoring one another, the idea of submitting to one another. So when somebody does something to you, kindness to them doesn't mean that you respond back in a negative way if they've treated you in a negative way. It means that you're willing to bow and still honor them with what you know God would want you to do, and that's reflecting kindness and goodness back to them, even though they may persecute you and prosecute you. He's saying there's none of that kind of bowing and honoring of goodness and kindness taking place within the land. Like on the surface, you may all look like a bunch of nice people, but you're only nice when you're nice to each other. And then the final thing is knowledge. There's no knowledge. Does that mean that there's really no knowledge in the land? Everybody's just walking around like cavemen? No. That means in the original language that knowledge is a beginner's knowledge, that is a perception of what is good and evil, that leads to a skill set that will help develop your life in the direction of that knowledge. So in other words, if I gain a little bit of knowledge, then I can use that knowledge to develop skills that will help me become better in that area of life. Right? So when I was young, I wrestled to get a few skills of wrestling, and then a little bit of knowledge of wrestling, and then I put that knowledge to use, and by putting that knowledge to use and action, it helps develop the skills in my life, and I grow in my skill set. I'm growing in my knowledge, right? And I'm getting better at it. And what he's saying is that there's no knowledge that's growing, and that word knowledge also comes back to the idea of knowledge, which is the Hebrew word yada, which is the idea of intimacy. So there's no growth in intimacy in this land. When you think about it, when it comes to truth, faithfulness, that idea of kindness and honoring each other, growing in intimacy and knowledge of each other to a place of intimacy. Like we can surface talk, my wife and I, but it'll never lead to intimacy unless we grow in our knowledge of each other. Then we grow in knowledge, and our growth in knowledge will lead to intimacy, right? And so that there's none of this taking place, but all three of these principles are what's expected if you want to have any sort of healthy relationship in life. They're all the foundational principles of a healthy relationship. Even if it's beyond marriage, if it's not just marriage, but it's a friendship. Like if Jim and I are developing a friendship and I don't have these three principles in place, it'll never be a strong, reliable, faithful friendship. They're foundational in this. And so, from there, we have the sins of omission to the sins of commission, which I'm just going to throw out what he lists here, not go too deep into it, but he lists swearing. Does anybody know of any swearing that takes place in our society? Lying, murder, stealing, adultery. Any of those are sins in our culture? Anarchy, that's not wanting to listen to what authority has to say when, they put rules in the law books for a reason and we decide that those rules and that authority isn't important. And finally, violence. Like, I don't know about you, but, I look at all of these things and I see this in our culture, and it seems to be becoming more and more prevalent in our culture as time goes on. It seems, of course, there's always been these sorts of sins upon the earth, but maybe it's just me getting older and more conservative, but it seems like you see more and more of it taking place. And you can look at this, and if you're not careful, here's what you're going to say. Yes, I see that in our society. Like I see it on TV and in the news, but in general, in my little culture here in the Silver Valley, a lot of this isn't really that prevalent or relevant. And thank goodness that I don't have to really deal with this because, I'm not somebody that's necessarily involved in this stealing and lying and committing adultery and murdering and violence, that sort of thing. Like that's the rest of the world, and thank goodness that that I'm not a part of that. That'd be a danger. And I want to tell you that though this is the list, I don't believe that this is an exhaustive list, that these are the only sins they were committed. But God is using this to make the point that he has made covenant with people, and that when we really understand God's desire for us, somebody hear me, his desire for you and I is not just for you to be able to someday say, I believe in God. Check it off on the survey that comes to your house. It's for you to understand this is about a relational love. He one time came to a people and he said, I will be your God and you will be my people. And they all said, I do. And that covenant is carried on to today to you and I when we say I do to Jesus in our lives. I do accept him as my personal Lord and Savior. I do accept him as the master of my life. I do accept him as a friend of sinners. I do accept him as the one who will give me an inheritance in life. He's my provider. He's my comforter. I do accept him as my groom. We're saying, I do. These people, they still confess Yahweh. They still confess God. I believe in God. But their actions say differently, and they're choosing to take the easy way and the good way. Okay. Let's go on from there. The consequences of sin. Verse 3, when we take the easy way out of relationship, here's the consequences. Verse 3 says, therefore the land will mourn and everyone who dwells there will waste away with the beasts of the field. The land will mourn. The beasts of the field will waste away, the birds of the air, even the fish of the sea will be taken away. Like God's trying to get his people to understand, if they haven't understood this before, that your sin affects more than just you. Your sin not only affects you and your relationship with him, but your sin affects the people around you. And it doesn't just affect the people around you, it literally affects the earth. Like sin plays a huge impact on all that we see, all of creation. And you see this idea starts in Genesis with the original curse. It's talking about man devouring the earth. And when you study in the original language that our sin would consume and devour, destroy the earth. And if that wasn't clear enough in the original curse, then God says in Leviticus and Deuteronomy that he will, if you're obedient to his ways, that he would bless even the land. But if you're not obedient, then the land would be absent of blessing, which would then mean that it would be cursed, right? And then you also see this played out in many different ways. You see it through the prophets, like being talked about now. In Revelation, what happens? Because of the sin of man, there's an area in Revelation chapter 8 where it says a third of the sea creatures will disappear from the earth. They'll die. A third of the sea creatures, amongst much other destruction in the land. Like our sin has a direct relation to the destruction of the earth. And I don't even want to get into like global warming or anything like that. I'm sure have some mixed views in our congregation. This isn't a political argument here. But this is a reality that if you look at a lot of destruction of the earth today, that it is due to you and I in our sin. That's right. Like you see that, I'm sure most of you have heard about the island that's like the size of Texas that's in the ocean and made up of plastic. And that's because humanity decided it was okay to just throw their garbage anywhere, including the ocean. You see polluted ocean, you see polluted rivers all throughout the earth because people decide to dump stuff in the rivers, including at one time the Silver Valley. You see destruction of buildings and things that are beautiful because of war, things that are ravished because of famine, famine because of greed. Like you see all of these things taking place, the destruction of the Amazon because people are trying to chop down all those trees for profit. Like you see greed and pride and all of these things literally destroying our earth. And then he says in verse 4, and it says, let no man contend or rebuke another. Like he's saying, don't rebuke anybody else for what I'm telling you right now. Some translations directly say, don't blame anybody else for these issues. because it's everybody's fault. Like, don't play the blame game. You want to get all righteous and you want to say, well, people are this way and they walk in this ignorance and they're all this certain aspect because they took prayer out of school years ago. And so let's blame the government. Let's blame the Supreme Court. Let's blame the education system. And if I'm going to point fingers at the way our society is living right now, then it's because of this system over here. And then I can blame the politicians because, there's still not abortion that's been banned upon the earth. And so we're suffering from the sin of abortion taking place. So it's all those politicians' fault, or it's the Supreme Court's fault. And we want to blame all of our little institutions, the education system. We want to blame the media for what's going on and their influence upon the next generation. And we're always wanting to point our fingers at everybody else. The reason why the earth is today is because of these guys and these guys and these guys over here. In reality, God's saying, listen, don't point the finger at anybody but yourself. He says, for your people are like those who contend with the priests. Therefore you shall stumble in the day, and the prophet shall also stumble with you in the night, and I will destroy your mother. And he's talking about Israel there. So what he's saying is like, I'm going to right now put the blame on 3 people. And he says he's put on 3 different things. He's putting it on the people, he's putting it on the priests, and he's putting it on the prophets. And here's what we have to understand is we all play a role. Like, how did you play a role? You're not out committing murder. You're not out committing adultery. Maybe you don't think when you look at that list of 7 sins of commission that that's a part of your life. You see that on the news and in society. But in some way, shape, or form, we all play a role. Because the reality is this. It also said that there's a lack of faithfulness. There's a lack of true mercy. Kindness, the honoring, being able to bow. There's a lack of surpassing love. So the reality is that when the world's looking for something that's steady, that they can go steady with, because there's a surety to it, and they see people who claim the truth, but yet bow when everything is coming against them, and they change what they say is true, and they don't live by what they say is true, then they continue to do their things, because why would they want to go steady with what you've got? Like, do Christians really have anything better? I see them living just as miserable and doing the same things that we do over here. There is no truth. There is no faithfulness. Yeah, you should see how they respond when somebody snaps at them and the way they act and the way they treat people. You know what? The reality is you don't have to be living all these sins of commission. You can just be living in the sins of omission, and you still played a big role on the destruction and the violence and all that's taking place in the earth today. Oh, you can be nice most of the time, but what about when the pressure really hits? And you can love most of the time, but what about when it's the greatest betrayal in your life and it really, really, really hurts you and nobody understands because they haven't been in what you've been in and done what you've done and went through what you've went through and walked in your shoes? But God says, I'm going to start here with the priests and the prophets. We always want to put our blame out there, but it starts in the house. It starts with the spiritual side of things. Because listen, if we had this right, faithful, obedient, surpassing love, dangerous love, tough love, restorative love, if we had this right, then it would play out here. And this would be right. And we'd be able to reflect a steadiness and a surety and a faithfulness, a true mercy to the world around us. So it starts here with the spiritual. And he says, I'm bringing it down to you, the priests. Like the priests were living this crazy life. They didn't even have truth in their own lives. And the reality is, like, yes, in modern day church, you can look at the pastors of churches today and you can say their life is a mess and they don't preach the full truth and all that sort of stuff that we want to put the blame on them. And there's some truth to that. And I hope that you guys don't ever think that I'm easy on you guys all the time and don't preach the hard stuff to you. But you could blame it on us. But the reality is the transfer of the priest in the Old Testament to modern day New Testament isn't necessarily just on me, because the Bible says that when it comes to all those who would receive Christ, that now you are called a royal priesthood. You have been given the mantle of a priest in your own life. So the question isn't so much that is Corey to blame for your issues, is you're to blame for your issues. Like you're a priest yourself, and how well are you priesting your family? How well are you priesting your friends? How well are you priesting your coworkers and the world around you? And are you showing faithfulness to those people? And are you showing a steadiness? And are you showing a surety and a reliability and a surpassing love that goes beyond, and the ability to forgive when nobody else in the world would forgive again, and love when nobody else in the world would love again? Are you showing those things in your own priesthood? Because it starts with the priesthood, you and I. He says in verse 6, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Probably the most popular verse in this chapter, if not this book. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Everybody say lack. Now again, that does not reference no knowledge. It says a lack of knowledge. Why? The next part of that verse says, because you have rejected knowledge, I will also reject you from being a priest for me. Like if you don't want to live like a Christian, then I don't need to take you as a Christian. And you're being destroyed for your lack of knowledge. Like it's not that you don't have knowledge, it's that you're rejecting knowledge. Romans 1 tells us we've all got a knowledge of God, and that in order to live the life that we live, according to Romans chapter 1, in sin, that you've got to suppress the knowledge. You've got to reject the knowledge. So in other words, this is about a people who are not just don't have any knowledge, they have a lack of knowledge, not because they don't, not because of any reason other than they reject the knowledge. They reject, it's like, yes, I know what to do. I know that I can do all things through Christ. I just don't want to do all things through Christ. It's that attitude. Yeah, I know that I can be steady because I can do all things through Christ, but I will reject being steady because I don't want to show steadiness because it'd be too difficult right now. Yeah, I know that I can show faithfulness to God because I can do all things through Christ, but I will reject that ability to show faithfulness when the certain people are around me because I don't want to show faithfulness to God when everybody else around me is doing other things, saying other things, and living a different life than I live. I will reject that knowledge because I don't want to be rejected. And then he goes on and he says, from there, because you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children. I'm going to throw this out real quick. It's not that God don't love children, so don't misread that. It's not that he doesn't care about the next generation, but what he's saying is that if you as adults don't have the knowledge of me and care to pursue the knowledge of me, then guess what? That's going to affect your children because my blessings come with your obedience. Your lack of obedience leads to the opposite of my blessing, and the lack of blessing means it's a curse. So unfortunately, because of your actions, it will eventually lead to the curse of your children. I won't bless your children. And the lack of my blessing is going to be a curse to their life. But don't blame me, God, for it. Look at your own life. Because the reality is God will bless a people. He will bless a family who walks in obedience. And oftentimes the blessings outlast the obedience. And you're living in post-blessings, not realizing that you're that far away from God, that eventually become a cursing because you've walked away from trying to do what's right in God's eyes until that place turns to a curse in life. And then you suffer for it, and your kids will suffer for it. And because you decided in life that God's not that important, the disciplines of God aren't that important, I don't really need to go to church, I don't need to read. I have a little bit of knowledge about God. And though you reject most of what you have, you don't worry about your kids. Like, you put them out in the field of life and, go have your way and do your thing and enjoy life. And, you're going to figure out your own way type of thing. Well, guess what? When they're not walking in the obedience of God, guess what happens? They're walking in the curse. And they're cursed. And like God put this principle upon mankind from the very beginning to multiply and fill the earth. Like, that's our responsibility, to have children. And then he says, now train them up in the ways of the Lord. In the ways of the Lord. So then there's a responsibility on having children. You just don't pop them out because you got knocked up. But now you actually got to train them up. You had them purposefully, and you're training them up because you want them to be righteous, purposeful, intentional, productive people of the world, displaying God in their lives. And so if we don't do that in our lives, then what was the point of even having children? And so they walk in the curse. And you could blame them, but the reality is they're not even to blame. Most of the time, it's the parents. And then he says, from there, verse 7, the more they increase, the more they sinned against me. I'll change their glory into shame. Like, this is just simply kind of the idea of birds of a feather flock together. You start hanging out enough, and you're doing this sort of life, then everybody increases their sin even more so. I won't go into that. Verse 8, they eat up the sin of my people and they set their heart on their iniquity. Two things. They eat up the sin of my people. They're talking about the priesthood in the Old Testament. The Levitical priests would eat the sacrifices of the people. The people made sacrifices because they sinned. So they would sin, sacrifice an animal. The benefit of the priesthood, they didn't get to own homes or property, but they would be provided for by the sins of the people. And so they'd get that meat, and they would eat up that meat, and that would be their provision for life. But this says that they would eat up the sins of the people, and the intention behind what's being said there is like they enjoyed the sins of the people, that it profited them and made them actually in a more prideful, arrogant type attitude. So it would be like, yes, they're going to bring something anyways for their sin, but man, Farmer Joe on the West Bank, like, he has these really good fat heifers, and the last time he brought one, man, we barbecued that thing after it was sacrificed. Like, we reheated up on the flames, we put this sauce on, man, we had this feast. Like, I hope that dude commits some great, maybe he'll bring 2 this next year. Like, falls into great sin. Like, that we really eat that stuff up, and we could have a feast. And then Barbara over here, she's got these little doves, and I don't know what she does with those things. If she feeds them honey or something, those things are sweet. So, like, maybe she'll cuss 10 times, and we'll have 10 of those things, and we'll have a whole feast out of the sins of the people. And then in Jesus' day, it wasn't just that they would feast and get fat off of the things, and they would glory in the people's sin, but in Jesus' day, they would take the sacrifices and sell them to people who couldn't travel to the temple, and they would jack up the prices. So they're not just now getting fat on the food that's being sacrifices, but now they're getting wealthy financially because they're jacking up prices because they know people have to come and repent for their sin by sacrificing. But then it's not just that, it's like they enjoy the sin of the people. Unless we just want to point fingers at Levitical priests from thousands of years ago, how does that relate to till today? Well, in today's church, absolutely. There's probably pastors that profit off of the shame and the guilt of their congregation. But the reality is this, when we're talking about the royal priesthood of believers, all of us being involved in this, is we eat up the sin of people. We feast on the sin of people. How do we feast on the sin of people? I'll tell you, like, with gossip is a great idea, like, is a great concept here, because I think that this is one of the easiest things to describe, and everybody gets this. But when somebody shares some good gossip with you, how do you feel? Like, you like it. Don't lie. That's one of the other sins. You're like, oh, wow, really? Half smile on your face. Really? Even if you know them and it's not good. Really? Oh, really? Like, you eat up their sin. Oh, I feel so bad. And then you've eaten of it and it tastes so sweet and so good, you've got to share that sweetness with somebody else. Like, oh, this is too good. This is too good. I've got to just listen to this. Oh, it breaks my heart so much. Can you believe that they did? Oh man, we really got to pray for those guys. Especially if it's somebody that's like harmed you or hurt you or spoke against you. Even if they're another Christian, you know what, yeah, well, they hurt you, and yeah, I've forgiven them, but there's still that little edge there, and you find out that something happened in their life, and you get that gossip, you're like, this is, wow. You feast on their sin. Right? And reality is that sin brings sorrow to God, not joy. And instead of feasting, he would expect fasting. And that there should be repentance taking place. But these people, I'm sure none of us, they've been feasting on the sins of their brothers and sisters. And then he goes on, right? In verse 9, or the rest of verse 8, he says, they set their heart on their iniquity. Like, I got to get us out of here sometime today, so I know this. But I missed this in the first service. They set their heart on their iniquity. What does that mean? That means whatever their sin is, they put their heart upon their sin. Like their heart, their passion is set upon their sin. Their life, their time, their efforts, their money, everything is set upon their sin. And when you put your heart upon something, then that something also becomes your identity. Like, so I become so passionate, it consumes me. So having been somebody who used to drink a lot when I was younger, like you would think that drinking would be, some people can drink normally, but I would think, I can't wait to get off of work and have a beer. And when I get off of work, I can't wait to have a beer. And then after I'm off of work, well, where can we go have a beer? And then we can have a beer here. And then, I can't just have one beer, but let me have another beer and then another beer. And then, and then when I wake up in the morning, I'm like, God, I'm not going to do that again. And then come, later on the day when I start feeling better, it'd be the same thing all over again. And the reality is that pretty soon, if you're not careful, that I'm putting my money into that. I'm putting my time into that. I'm putting my efforts, because I will go out of my way in order to do what I want to do over here in my iniquity. Right? So my time, my money, and my efforts are set upon this, and then that becomes my identity. Oh, that Corey, have you seen him, man? He's such a party animal. Oh yeah, now I'm the party animal. There's a little bit of pride in my iniquity, and that becomes my identity, and so now I've got to be the party animal, and so I commit even more time and more money and more effort to living up to my identity that I have created through my iniquity, because I've set my heart on my sin. Okay, next verse. Harlotry. Oh, wait. Verse 9. It shall be like people like priests, so we mirror each other. So I will punish them for their ways and reward them for their deeds. They shall eat but not have enough. Anybody understand that concept? Eat but not have enough? It's like eating Chinese food. Like I'm full, and then a half hour later I got leftovers in the microwave. All right. I always love the example of our coffee stand. For 2 years, I wanted to put 32-ounce cups in our coffee stand. My wife did not want to put 32-ounce cups in the coffee stand, as she felt like it would be a sin to put 32-ounce cups in our coffee stand. Because, my wife, she likes to exercise and be healthy. She's like, this is so wrong. Like, people getting 32-ounce, why? We can't sell this. We can't support this. I'm like, money, baby. This lady came through from Oregon's a barista. She said one time, what's your largest size? 24? What? Like at my stand in Oregon, we had 32. We jumped to 64. Now we have 90-something. Like people just keep buying and buying and buying. And like I can't believe you guys don't have 32. I said, man, we are going to 32, right? And inevitably now we've sold 32 ounces for a year or two, right? And 32 ounces probably double the sales of 12 ounces. like it's the consumption of our society. And to put Red Bulls inside of a 32-ounce cup with sugar, Torani syrup added to the Red Bull already, and then, hand that out the window. I mean, I'm a hypocrite right now because like, you feel like such a sinner. Right? But this is the consumption of society. You're never satisfied. You're never content. And I'm not just talking about Red Bulls and coffee. I'm talking about sin in general. Right? You're never content. You will never get enough to satisfy you. You will always think, and that's part of the curse of sin. And he goes on in verse 11, harlotry, wine, and new wine enslave the heart. I could pick on wine drinkers, but I won't. But like, sex and drinking, harlotry and wine. Why did he put those two together? They just so easily go together, right? Sex and drinking. And what does he have to say about these two things? That they enslave the heart. Now, the idea in the original language, and depending on the translation you're reading, will say that it makes you, it uses the word stupor, right? Stupor. Like he's in a drunken stupor right now. What does that mean? You're stupid. Right? Let's just be real. A drunken stupor means that you're acting stupid. And what he's saying here is that, when you're into harlotry and you're into the wine and the new wine, that it dulls your senses and makes you dumb. Because that eventually, that dulling of your senses and your focus and you setting your heart upon your sin, your iniquity, makes you into such a place that you can't even focus on the more important things in life anymore. It's all about just these little things. And eventually, it doesn't just make you dumb, but it enslaves you. And part of its ability to enslave you is because it first made you dumb. He goes on in verse 12 and he says, for my people, this is it. Like, listen, man, sex and drinking, they just make you dumb. Now, let me explain how dumb this is. Verse 12. My people ask counsel from wooden idols. And their staff, their wooden staff, informs them. For the spirit of harlotry has caused them to stray, and they have played the harlot against their God. They continue to do things that God doesn't want them to do. They offer sacrifices on mountaintops and burn incense on the hills under oaks, poplars, terebinths, because their shade is good. This is talking about false idol worship. We could talk about people who say they don't need to go to church to worship God because they worship God in the mountains. But Dave brought his RV to church today before he went to the mountains, so we won't talk about that. But listen, it's made them so dumb that they talk to wooden sticks. Right? And if that's not stupid, that you would talk to a wooden stick, that you would think that stick talks back to you. Like, that's even stupider, right? I'm going to talk to this stick, and I think that the stick is going to talk back to me. That's how dumb they were becoming because of the sin in their life. They are worshiping the creation and not the creator. That's what Paul describes in chapter 1 of the book of Romans. And lest we think that we're any different, these people are looking for something, anything in their stupidity, their stupor of life, their dullness of life, and their lack of knowledge that will give them something that makes them feel better about themselves and their life, that they will do these things. They will reach out and do stupid stuff and expect to receive something back for it. And we can look at people who would say this about wooden sticks or totem poles or clay gods that people have created, or we can look at this as, the TV, a piece of plastic mold that has electricity running through it, could do the exact same thing to us. I'm not picking on TV, but we do a lot of things in life that we are willing to spend a lot of money on, a lot of time doing, a lot of effort towards it, because we receive something from it that we should be receiving from God himself. False idols. Therefore your daughters commit harlotry, your brides commit adultery. I'll not punish your daughters when they commit adultery, nor your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go apart with harlots and offer sacrifices with a ritual harlot. He's describing temple worship where they would go and sleep with prostitutes, and they were sending their brides and their daughters in order to be temple prostitutes. But God's not blaming them because the men would send them at that time, and then the men themselves go sleep with temple prostitutes. So if you're to blame, he's blaming actually the men and the fathers, the husbands, for doing this sort of thing. Therefore people who do not understand will be trampled. Verse 15. Though you, Israel, play the harlot, let not Judah offend. Do not come up to Gilgal, nor up to Beth Haven, nor swear an oath, saying, as the Lord lives. What's he saying? If you remember just quickly at the beginning of this series, that right now northern Israel, at the time of Hosea, is in big trouble for their sins. The southern kingdom, Judah, they're doing okay. They're still living righteously. And what he's saying right now is he's speaking actually to Judah. You hear all these words that I got to say about your brother up here? And the life that he's living? Like I'm telling you right now, don't frequent these places of sin. These places that once Beth Aven, which was Bethel, the place of God at one time, but now it's Beth Aven. It's become a place of sin. Like all of these places I've named were once something that appeared as good, but now it has become evil. Like I'm telling you, if you don't want to go down the same road your big brother's about to go down, then I would stay out of these places of sin. You don't want to get caught up in the same things that they're doing, living the life that they're living, then avoid the places of sin that they frequent. Somebody hear me? And then he says in there, verse 16, for Israel is stubborn like a stubborn calf. He's referencing probably Baal, the golden calf. They're stubborn. So the Lord will let them forage, eat, graze, enjoy life like a lamb in open country. Ephraim is joined to idols. Let him alone. So he's joined to an idol. God's saying, let him be. Their drink is rebellion, and they commit harlotry continually. Her rulers dearly love dishonor. So we enjoy just being rebellious in life, like it's a cool thing. It's a part of our identity to do all this kind of crazy stuff. We'd rather identify, or people identify us with, this sort of life, this freedom, rebelliousness. Verse 19, the wind has wrapped her up in its wings, meaning it will take her anywhere the wind goes, and they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. So what's God saying? He's like, listen, you've come to a place as a people where you've rejected me so much, the knowledge of me, the intimacy of me, the truth, the faithfulness, where you've rejected all these things, that I'm just going to let you go. You don't like my rules of the Bible. You don't like the boundaries that I've tried to give you in order for you to live a healthy life, a prosperous life. You don't like those boundaries, then I'm going to give you freedom. I'm going to cut you loose. So if you really just enjoy crossing over those and identifying with those and doing those types of things, I'm going to let you loose like a lamb in open country. Have your freedom. Go your way. Do your thing. And we think that might sound good, but the reality is this, that a lamb in open country is dangerous. Because eventually, that lamb will be devoured. God's hoping to set it free, that it'll return to him. But if we don't, you get destroyed by sin. And this sounds like tough love, but it really always comes back to this relationship. God wants a faithful relationship with you and I. Like, what would it be like if I told my wife, baby, I'm happy that we're married, but, I decide I'll step out whenever I want. Do what I want to do. She needs me to come home. I decide to go to the bar. She needs me to take out the garbage. I let it pile up for a month. I don't listen to her words. I don't do the things that she needs me to do for her. I go my own way, continually turn my... Like, what is that? Just picture that kind of love. Like, that's not relational love, and that's what God's trying to get across to us. Yes, it sounds harsh, but all he's doing is trying to get us to the place where we will at least see what we're doing, have this comprehension of how often we turn our back to him and betray him, and we choose to live this life our own way. And yet God's saying, man, I just want you in my life. I want you to be faithful to me. You know, those sins that Israel omitted are all the same things that reflect a person's commitment to a relationship. Like, all he wants is our faithfulness, our surety, our reliability, that he can count on you as his bride. He wants your kindness, your honor, that you would have the ability to, even when it's tough love, that you can look past that toughness and still give love. Still give kindness and goodness. He wants you to understand that it's got to be more than just a surface belief, but that there is need for growth in this relationship. That where we will have open conversation, we'll be able to talk, and we'll be able to grow in knowledge of each other that leads to a place of intimacy, a personal, one-on-one, intimate relationship with our God. All aspects of a healthy relationship, of any relationship, including the marriage relationship. And at the same time, we know that all of these, faithfulness, love, honor, and cherish each other, right? They take work to cultivate. And when we say that we believe in God and yet we don't display these qualities and reproduce them in our lives, it pretty much shows to the world around us that we have no real commitment. Theologian Terence Fretheim once said, to know God, to say that you know God, is to be in a right relationship with him, with characteristics of love, trust, respect, and open communication. His incomprehensible love is a relational love, and it always comes back to how much he really wants you and I in his life. He's willing to do whatever it takes. In fact, he's already given his one and only son, Jesus, to die on the cross so that we will choose him and come to him once again. Are you willing to do what it takes to give him that same relational love?